Thank you so much, Colin, for that kind introduction. And also, I have to say, Colin has been the most gracious of hosts since I arrived in Ottawa with a full entourage. Not only my 6-month-old son, but my mother, who is graciously looking after him right now. And Colin squired us to and from our billet, so thank you. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Diane. So I thought I would read, I'll read you 10 poems this evening, all of them quite short, maybe talk a bit about them and around them. 3 from my first book that are sort of in a more, I suppose, scholarly or mythopoetic vein. 3 from my second book, which are really more personal, I suppose. And then some new work at the end. Though I think, really, sometimes the scholarly poems or the mythopoetic poems are actually the most personal. It's just that I'm hiding, behind many masks. My first book, Groundwork, is divided into 3 sections, and the first section is set around and about a kind of fantastical archaeological site in modern-day Tunisia. The second section is set in a very unorthodox Garden of Eden, in and out of this unorthodox Garden of Eden. And the third section of the book is sort of a reweaving of stories from Homer's Odyssey. And, it does all sound very ponderous and scholarly, but basically, I kind of am stuck in my childhood. I discovered a book of sort of a retelling of the classical myths for children when I was about 8 years old, and I was just entranced by this and have continued to think about those stories and to be sort of re-entranced by them and by their ability to speak to the ongoingness of life. So when I was in my 20s, my husband and I moved to Newfoundland, and it was my first experience of living by the ocean. And I reread the Odyssey then as an adult while I was living on this rocky island. Odysseus, the traveler of the Odyssey, is also from a rocky island. And I love how, he describes this island as really, a nothing of a place where horses can't graze and all of this, but he loves it. It sort of impels him through 20 years of hardship and homecoming. And, Newfoundland also, they call it the rock, and not much grows there and all of this. But, anyone who's from there has a hard case of homesickness pretty much for life. And I can make no claim to being a Newfoundlander, but I did catch a little bit of the homesickness bug while I was there. So anyway, I'm going to read 3 poems from this series. The first one is called Lookout. As I was writing these poems, I was thinking, about how, in some sense, the Odysseus character, the traveler, and the Penelope character, the maker, she's a weaver who waits. You can really think of these as being 2 aspects of a single personality. They're in some ways 2 aspects of art making, the aspect of it that is traveling and the aspect of it that is waiting, doing and undoing all these things. And so a lot of the poems are sort of meditations on that, but this one certainly is. It's in the voice of the kind of Penelope figure in the series. Lookout. I watched the women hanging up the wash and thought, a single line strung taut, the simplest tapestry. Horizon. Sky above and sea below. For 20 years, I've known no other story. Trouble is, no sooner do you get down to the wire, someone plucks it and begins, tell me, muse of the man of many ways. For a single line is also the simplest liar. When we were living in Newfoundland, my husband found an object on the beach. And being landlubbers, neither of us recognized it. So we just brought it home and put it on our mantelpiece and waited for someone to explain to us what it was. And it turned out it was a grapnel, like a grappling hook that you would use to secure a small boat or perhaps to retrieve your rigging. But it had been rusted almost beyond recognition. It really looked like kind of a gnarled hand or a piece of vine. And, sort of meditating on this object, I got thinking about other sorts of transformations that are wrought by the sea or by the land. And the wonderful story in the Odyssey about Odysseus going to try to talk to the spirit of Tiresias, the seer, about how the heck to get back home, and sort of what lay ahead of him. And Tiresias tells him that you will come home, but after many hardships. But then your travels won't be over. You've angered the sea god Poseidon, and in order to propitiate him, you need to make a further journey, this time inland, and you need to carry your oar over your shoulder. And when you get to a place where a person asks you what you're doing with that winnow fan, mistaking the oar for this agricultural implement, then you've gone far enough, and you plant your oar in the ground there and make sacrifices to the gods. And then he says, you will die in a sleek old age and ex halos. And this phrase ex halos is famously contested in translations of the Odyssey because it can mean either from the sea or far from the sea. So Odysseus' death is either going to come to him from the sea or far from the sea. We don't really know. So anyway, this poem is also sort of a meditation on the metamorphoses wrought by translation. And being a monoglot, I can only encounter the Odyssey in translation, alas. Translations. You don't have to go far inland these days to have your oar mistaken for a winnow fan, your grapnel for a crook. But then, you've never had to go far out to sea to have your bones mistaken for coral, your eyes for pearls. The sea is always the land the sea translating into imperfect argots, into argle, argos, argosies, argling the meaning of ex halos till the sun goes down and all the journeying ways are darkened, until the ship goes down and all hands babble of green fields. Inland, Odysseus comes to grapnel in his father's vineyard. Planting his oar among the vines, he tells Laertes of his quest. A woman offered me a calyx, or was it a conch shell, a coracle, one draught from which would make a man seem other than he was. My dear companions, pigs, with the heads and voices and bristles of pigs. I thought them none the worse for that. Laertes trowels among his plants. Ah, in the pearl of the beholder. What became of the calyx then? Odysseus says, that vessel broke, and all the journeying ways were darkened. As they talk, the sun goes down. The sun goes down, all hands are lost. Odysseus picks up his winnow fan and babbles of green swells. The final poem in the series is called Vessel. And when I was an undergraduate studying classics, I was really intrigued by these things called bilingual vessels. If you've seen any Greek pottery in museums, you'll see the black figure vessels where you have the sort of black figures in silhouette against the background of the red Attic clay, and then you'll see red figure vessels where the figures appear in red silhouette, sort of the base color of the clay, and the kind of background is in black. So these two styles, they were sort of there was a sense of development. In general, the red figure style succeeded the black figure style, but there was a period where these two styles were sort of in common usage, and these bilingual vessels have designs, often the same design on two sides, but one in the black figure style and one in the red figure style. So, in my sort of reverie about translations and opposites and land and sea and all of this, I found this tremendously evocative. So anyway, here's the final poem in the book. Bilingual vessel. Late archaic. A woman the color of clay looks out across the vessel's sintered black. In all that dark water, never a bright sail. O verso, this same woman, now in silhouette, looks out across the vessel's ground, unsintered red. In all that bright water, never a black ship. Pour out the water, From the vantage of the vase painter, the distant traveler, this momentary column holds you up. So my second book, All the Daylight Hours, was actually sort of written simultaneously. You know, I had these kind of two books in the hopper for about 12 years. And this one is, at least on the surface, the more personal book. It's the book where the family poems are and all of this. It contains an awful lot of Christmas poems, actually, because many of these poems had their first life in Christmas keepsakes that my husband and I printed on a little tabletop press and sent round to friends and family. And because there are a lot of Christmas poems, there are a lot of poems about children, babies, you know, of this, the miracle of life and the new year and all of this. But as the book goes on, this baby becomes distinctly less archetypal and more real, because I became pregnant while working on this book. And the last written poems in the book are ones that followed the birth of my first son. So I thought I would read you sort of a triptych of poems from this book, one from the sort of you know, child as abstract stage of the game, and one from the kind of child as very real stage of the game, and one sort of from in between. So the first one is called Lullaby. My little lack of light, my swaddled soul, December baby. Hush, for it is dark, and will grow darker still. We must embark directly. Bring an orange as the toll for Charon, he will be our gondolier. Upon the shore the season pans for light, and a solstice fish, their eyes gone milky white, come bearing riches for the dying year. Solstitial kingdom, it is yours, the mime of branches and the drift of snow. With shaking hands Persephone, the winter's wife, will tender you a gift. Born in a time of darkness, you will learn the gift of making. You shall make your consolation all your life. This poem is called Cleaning Out the Barn, and its epigraph, Sie ließen immer Raum, they always left room, is from one of Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus. And in this poem, Rilke's talking about the unicorn and how the unicorn comes to exist because we leave room for it to exist. So, cleaning out the barn. We've swept the mouse shit from the corners, pitched the fork with the broken tines, and stacked the wood. You could get married or act out a nativity in here. A manger for a bed because the innkeep had no room. I don't know how to leave no room. The unicorn may lift its head, but God will not be courted by an empty barn, a port in air. Fill up the measure of your lines. Outside the poem, the child is born. And then this final poem from this collection is called Scale. And it's based on the true story of my husband going to install a very elaborate art piece in New Brunswick a week before our baby was due. And I became quite nervous, you know. And so, you know, writing this poem was in part like distraction therapy. But anyway, it takes us back to the world of the Odyssey, amongst other things. But it's called Scale. 3 weeks before our son was born, you went out east to build a barn from panels of translucent glass. Set in the middle of the marsh with nothing close at hand for scale, the barn might have been large enough to accommodate a man, or small enough for him to reach his arms around it. It took a while to build the barn. The week you planned to be away turned into 2. You said you felt like Odysseus, his wife and infant son at home, detained for years beyond his expectations. I think about Odysseus, set in the middle of his story, nothing close at hand for scale. It's hard to tell if it's his ship that carries him back home or he who carries his black ship back into harbor. A lot of things are like that now. These days I carry around our son, who one day will carry us around inside him. So since I started having babies, all of my poems are very short. And I've been writing poems, I'm kind of a little bit back working in this mythopoetic vein, but it's partly kind of the vein of convenience. I had started reading around in Ovid's Metamorphoses, really right after my first son was born, and it's the great book of changes in classical mythology, and early parenthood is such a time of changes, and for many people, and certainly for me, coincides with the aging of one's own parents, and so your sense in the whole kind of your place in the whole kind of generational picture is really in flux. And so I started writing these Metamorphoses poems as a way really to kind of explore this time of changes in my own life, and they're all these very short things. So the first one is called Pyrrha. Pyrrha, the wife of Deucalion, being one of the two human survivors of the Great Flood in Ovid. And Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth by throwing stones behind them, the stones turning into people, their sons and daughters. Pyrrha. Behind us, bones return to stone, to earth, to our great mother. Is one allowed to turn around and look? Poking about amid the wrack, I found this leaf, its mark, made some million years ago in mud, in shale, its signature still binding, or at least still there for the finding, for the keeping. Above the high water, its mark, in mud, a cancel of its mark. The story of Daphne and Apollo occurs very early on in the Metamorphoses, and it's one of the best-known stories. Daphne, pursued by Apollo, is changed into a tree by a god who's attempting to protect her in that way from his advances. Daphne. Poet, that fear of staying put, your legs and arms arrested, nightmare style. Her feet, but now so swift, were anchored fast in numb, stiff roots. Of worst, the tongue gone wooden in the mouth, its language leafing helpless out into a silent spring, is yours, not mine. I evade your grasp with his. I run not out of utterance, but into it. And this is Psyche. There's Keats's wonderful ode to Psyche that ends with these lines about a candle and a window ope at night to let the warm love in, because Psyche's beloved was Eros, the god of love. Psyche. A candle and a window ope at night to let him in? Nope. I don't need a flame to know my flame, in bed or out. He's no matinee idol, no god, no demon, no devil, no fly-by-night Broadway romance, no hero, no Clark Kent. My dear, the dark glass is the face, the same. He's love by any other name. And then the final poem I'm going to read to you, also from the series of Metamorphoses poems, is called Callisto. Callisto being a nymph who's transformed into a bear. Before you were born, I licked you into shape. How is it now I am not capable of recognizing you, nor you me? Nor, for that matter, I, she who, it seems, for paws and claws with which to guard you, has traded her lily hands, her golden hair. Perhaps when you are older, we'll be able to pick out the constellations, the hunter, the great bear. Thanks so much.